The morning mist clung to the grasslands like a widow's veil, reluctant to lift even as the sun climbed higher over the Montana horizon. Margaret Thornton stood at the edge of her father's property, watching the cattle move slowly through the dew-soaked pasture. Her hands, rough from years of mending fences and tending livestock, gripped the wooden rail of the corral. She'd been up since before dawn, as was her way. From the house behind her came the sound of laughter, light and musical, the kind that made men stop in their tracks. Her younger sister Eleanor was awake, no doubt entertaining their father with some story from yesterday's church social. Eleanor had that gift, the ability to make even the dreariest tales sparkle like fool's gold in a prospector's pan. Margaret didn't turn at the sound. She knew what she'd see if she did Eleanor in one of her pretty morning dresses, the pale blue one perhaps, with her golden hair catching the light just so. It wasn't jealousy that kept Margaret's eyes on the horizon. She'd long ago made peace with the order of things. Eleanor was the beauty, the one who drew proposals like honey drew flies. Margaret was the one who kept the ranch running while their father's health declined and the hired hands came and went with the seasons. The year was 1883, and Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that sprouted up wherever the railroad decided to lay tracks. It had one main street, dusty in summer and muddy in spring, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and not much else worth mentioning. The Thornton Ranch sat 3 miles outside town, close enough for Sunday services but far enough that unexpected visitors were rare. Margaret heard boots on the porch boards her father's uneven gait. Samuel Thornton had taken a fall from his horse 2 winters back and never quite recovered his stride. She finally turned, seeing him lean heavily on his cane while Eleanor hovered at his elbow, ready to steady him if needed. "Margaret," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Leave off watching those beasts and come have breakfast." She obeyed, as she always did, stopping at the pump to wash the smell of leather and horse from her hands. In the kitchen, Eleanor had already set the table with their mother's good china, another of her habits, treating every meal like company might arrive. Margaret preferred the everyday tin plates. They didn't show dirt as readily and didn't break when dropped. "Mrs. Patterson says the Garrison boy is coming home," Eleanor announced as Margaret took her seat. "Can you imagine 5 years driving cattle up from Texas, and now he's got enough saved to buy the old Mitchell place?" Margaret remembered Jake Garrison, a serious boy who'd left town the year their mother died. He'd been 17 then, all gangly limbs and determined jaw. She wondered if the trail had hardened him the way it did most men, turning them lean and weathered as old fence posts. "The Mitchell place needs work," Margaret said, spreading butter on a thick slice of bread. "Roof's half caved in, and the well's gone brackish." "Oh, Margaret," Eleanor sighed. "Must you always be so practical? It's romantic. Don't you think a young man making his fortune and returning home?" Their father chuckled. "Your sister's right about the roof, Ellie, but I suppose young Garrison knows what he's getting into. Boy always did have a good head on his shoulders." The conversation drifted to other topics, the price of beef, the need for new hymn books at church, whether the autumn rains would come early. Margaret listened with half an ear while planning her day. The fence in the north pasture needed mending, and one of the mares was showing signs of colic. She'd need to mix a bran mash and keep watch. Eleanor, meanwhile, chattered about the harvest dance coming up in 2 weeks. She already had 3 young men vying to escort her, and the dressmaker in town was altering their mother's green silk gown to fit her perfectly. "You'll wear your blue dress, won't you, Margaret?" Eleanor asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice, for all their differences. Eleanor did care, in her way. "If I go," Margaret replied. She usually did, standing along the wall with the other spinsters and matrons, watching Eleanor spin across the floor like a butterfly among moths. After breakfast, Margaret escaped to the stables. This was her domain, where things made sense. Horses didn't care if your hair was more brown than gold, or if your hands were calloused, or if you preferred discussing grain prices to gossip. She found the ailing mare and set to work, mixing warm water with bran and a touch of molasses. The morning passed in familiar rhythms. She cleaned stalls, checked hooves, mended tack. When the sun reached its peak, she led the mare out for a gentle walk, watching for signs of improvement. It was then she saw the rider approaching from the east, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Even at a distance, she could tell it wasn't one of their usual visitors. The man sat his horse too well, moved with it like they were one creature. As he drew closer, she recognized the broad shoulders and the way he held his head Jake Garrison, though the boy she remembered had been replaced by something altogether different. 5 years on the trail had carved away anything soft in him. His face was all angles now, bronzed by sun and wind. He wore his gun low on his hip, the way men did when they'd had cause to use it. But his eyes dark brown. She remembered they were the same, serious and steady. He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Thornton." "Mr. Garrison." She kept her hand on the mare's halter. "Glad to have something to do. Heard you were back." News travels fast. His gaze swept over the ranch buildings, taking inventory. "Place looks well kept." "We manage." She didn't mention the nights she'd spent reshingling the barn roof herself, or the mornings she'd broken ice on the water troughs with bleeding hands. "Is your father at home? I'd like to pay my respects." Margaret nodded toward the house. "He'll be pleased to see you. Eleanor's there too." Something flickered across his face at her sister's name interest. Perhaps, or memory. Every young man in the county had that same look when Eleanor was mentioned. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Not quite envy, but something close to it. "I'll see to my horse first," Jake said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent years in the saddle. Margaret found herself watching as he led his mount toward the water trough. He moved with economy, no wasted motion, and he handled his horse with the gentle firmness that spoke of respect rather than domination. She turned away before he could catch her staring, leading the mare back toward the stable. Inside the cool dimness of the barn, she allowed herself a moment to lean against the rough wood wall. Jake Garrison had come home, and like every other man who'd laid eyes on Eleanor, he'd soon be spinning in her orbit. Margaret had seen it too many times to hope for anything different. She heard voices from the house, Eleanor's bright laugh, her father's deeper tones, and Jake's measured responses. Through the barn's open door, she could see them on the porch. Eleanor had changed into her yellow dress, the one that made her look like a spring daffodil. She was serving lemonade, playing hostess with the natural grace that Margaret could never quite master. Margaret returned to her work. There were always more chores, more tasks that needed doing. The ranch didn't run on pretty dresses and musical laughter. It ran on sweat and stubbornness, on getting up before dawn and working past dusk. She'd learned that lesson young, and it had served her well. But as the afternoon wore on and Jake Garrison's voice drifted across the yard, Margaret found herself pausing more often, listening despite herself. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the usual run of Eleanor's admirers. Maybe it was the steadiness in his voice, or the way he asked practical questions about the ranch's operations. When the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret finally made her way back to the house. Jake was preparing to leave, his horse saddled and waiting. "Miss Margaret," he said, touching his hat brim again. "Your father tells me you're the one who keeps this place running." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct attention. "We all do our part." Not everyone would see it that way. He swung up into the saddle with that same fluid grace. "I'll be back to speak with your father about some business. Good day to you both." Eleanor waved prettily as he rode away. "Isn't he handsome? And so mysterious now. Don't you think all those years on the trail imagined the stories he could tell?" Margaret didn't answer. She was watching the dust settle in Jake's wake, thinking about the way he'd said her name. Not Miss Thornton like before, but Miss Margaret. as if making a distinction that mattered. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to Eleanor's gentle breathing from across the room, Margaret stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about steady brown eyes and work-hardened hands. Such thoughts were dangerous for a woman like her, a woman built for practicality rather than romance. Tomorrow would bring more work, more of the same endless cycle that kept the ranch alive. And if Jake Garrison came calling again, well, he'd come for Eleanor like all the others. Margaret had learned long ago to find her satisfaction in a job well done rather than in foolish dreams. But still, in the darkness, she remembered the way he'd noticed who really kept the place running. It was a small thing, barely worth marking. Yet she held onto it like a smooth stone in her pocket, something to turn over in quiet moments. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and bringing the smell of coming rain. Margaret closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep. Morning would come early, as it always did, and the cattle wouldn't care about her restless thoughts. The church bell rang out across Cedar Ridge, its bronze voice carrying over the rooftops and into the surrounding plains. Margaret adjusted her bonnet one last time before stepping down from the wagon, her father already making his slow way toward the church doors with his cane. Eleanor floated beside him in her best Sunday dress, the cream-colored one with tiny pearl buttons that caught the morning light. It had been 3 weeks since Jake Garrison's return, and in that time, he'd become the chief topic of conversation among the town's female population. He'd purchased the Mitchell place as planned and hired a crew of men to begin repairs. More importantly, he'd attended church each Sunday, sitting in the back pew with his hat in his lap and his attention fixed firmly on Reverend Mills. Margaret took her usual seat, third row from the front, with Eleanor on one side and her father on the other. The congregation was still filing in, neighbors greeting each other with nods and whispered pleasantries. Mrs. Patterson, the town's most dedicated gossip, leaned across the aisle. "The Garrison boy's looking mighty fine," she stage-whispered to Eleanor. "Clean-shaven and wearing a proper suit, not like some of these cowboys who think dungarees are suitable for the Lord's house." Eleanor smiled demurely, her cheeks pinking just enough to be becoming. Margaret focused on her hymnal, though she couldn't help noticing when Jake entered. He moved with the same quiet confidence he showed on horseback, finding his customary back pew without fanfare. The service began, Reverend Mills's voice rising and falling in familiar cadences. Margaret tried to concentrate on the sermon, something about storing up treasures in heaven rather than on earth, but found her mind wandering. She was calculating feed costs for winter, mentally reviewing which sections of fence needed the most urgent attention. It wasn't until the congregation rose for the final hymn that she felt a prickling awareness along her spine. She glanced back and found Jake Garrison looking directly at her, not at Eleanor, whose golden hair gleamed like a halo in the light from the tall windows. At her. Margaret turned away quickly, heat climbing her neck. She'd misunderstood. Surely, the angle, perhaps, or a trick of the light. Men didn't look at her that way, with such focused intent. After the service, the congregation spilled out onto the church lawn for the social hour. Eleanor was immediately surrounded by admirers, the Baker twins, young Tom Morrison, and half a dozen others. Margaret helped her father to a bench in the shade, then went to assist Mrs. Mills with laying out the refreshment table. She was arranging teacups when a shadow fell across the white tablecloth. "Can I help with anything, Miss Margaret?" Jake stood before her, his Sunday suit emphasizing his broad shoulders. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, carved by years of squinting into the sun. She gestured helplessly at the cups, flustered by his proximity. "Mrs. Mills has a system." "I'm sure she does." He picked up the heavy water pitcher before she could reach for it. "Where does this go?" They worked in silence for a moment, Margaret intensely aware of his presence. He smelled of soap and leather, with something else underneath the indefinable scent of open spaces and hard work. Your father says you've been running the ranch near single-handed since he took ill, Jake said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor helps, Margaret replied automatically. Does she? There was something in his tone that made her look up. He was watching her with those steady brown eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling he saw more than she meant to show. Mr. Garrison. Eleanor's voice carried across the lawn like silver bells. You simply must settle an argument for us. Tom insists that Longhorns are superior to Herefords, but I've heard you have opinions on the matter. Jake's expression didn't change, but something shuddered in his eyes. He set down the pitcher carefully. Excuse me, Miss Margaret. Margaret watched him walk away, watched Eleanor link her arm through his and lead him into the circle of young people. This was the natural order of things, she reminded herself. Beautiful girls like Eleanor collected admirers like some people collected stamps. Plain, practical girls like Margaret collected responsibilities. The social hour continued its predictable course. Margaret served tea, cleaned up spills, and helped old Mrs. Garrett to a chair when the heat became too much. She was wrapping leftover cake when she noticed Jake had extricated himself from Eleanor's circle and was deep in conversation with her father. Samuel Thornton was nodding seriously, occasionally gesturing with his cane. Jake listened with the kind of attention most young men reserved for talk of horses or hunting. Whatever they were discussing, it held them through 2 cups of coffee and long after most of the congregation had dispersed. Finally, Jake shook her father's hand and turned to leave. His path took him past the refreshment table where Margaret was packing the last of the dishes. Your father's invited me to Sunday dinner, he said. I hope that won't be an inconvenience. Of course not. Margaret kept her eyes on the tablecloth she was folding. Eleanor loves having company. And you? The question caught her off guard. She looked up to find him watching her with that same intent expression from the church. Dinner's at 1 o'clock, she managed. Don't be late. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Yes, ma'am. The ride home was filled with Eleanor's chatter about the social dynamics of the church lawn, who had spoken to whom, what Mrs. Patterson had said about the new school teacher, how lovely the widow Morrison looked in her purple dress. Margaret let the words wash over her while she mentally reviewed what they had in the larder. The roast would do, with potatoes and the last of the green beans from the garden. Back at the ranch, Margaret threw herself into dinner preparations with more vigor than strictly necessary. She took out the good plates, Eleanor's territory, usually, and even picked wildflowers for the table. When Eleanor offered to help, Margaret sent her to change out of her church dress, preferring the familiar rhythm of kitchen work to her sister's well-meaning interference. Jake arrived precisely at 1, his horse's hooves announcing him before he came into view. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he dismounted, noting the ease with which he moved. 5 years on the trail had made him comfortable in his own skin, in a way the boy she remembered had never been. Eleanor greeted him at the door, having changed into her green dress, the one that brought out the color of her eyes. She led him into the parlor where their father waited, and soon Margaret could hear the low rumble of masculine conversation. When she called them to dinner, Jake rose immediately to pull out Eleanor's chair. It was the polite thing to do, the expected thing. Margaret busied herself with bringing in the dishes, trying not to notice the way Eleanor's hand lingered on his arm. This is fine cooking, Miss Margaret, Jake said after his first bite of roast. Reminds me of Sunday dinners before. He stopped, seeming to catch himself. Before your mother passed. Samuel Thornton finished gently. She was a good woman. Your mother, a fine cook, too. Jake nodded, his expression tightening briefly before smoothing out. Margaret found herself wanting to know what memories flickered behind his eyes, what 5 years on the trail had taught him about loss and loneliness. Tell us about Texas, Eleanor prompted, leaning forward with bright interest. It must have been terribly exciting, all those adventures. More dusty than exciting, most days. Jake cut his meat with precise movements. Dust in your food, dust in your bedroll, dust in places dust has no business being. But surely there were Indians. Eleanor persisted. And bandits and storms and— Ellie, Margaret interrupted quietly. Let the man eat. Jake glanced at her, that half-smile appearing again. It's all right. Yes, Miss Eleanor. There were all those things. Lost men to all of them, too. The trail's no place for romance, despite what the dime novels say. The conversation shifted to safer topics, the progress on the Mitchell place, the prospects for fall harvest, the new minister coming to the school. Jake answered questions readily enough, but volunteered little, and Margaret found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a stillness to him that hadn't been there before, the kind that came from spending long nights watching for trouble. His hands bore the scars of rope burns and hard work. When he reached for his water glass, she noticed his knuckles had been broken at least once. After dinner, Eleanor suggested they take coffee on the porch to catch the breeze. Margaret began clearing dishes, waving away Eleanor's half-hearted offer of help. Through the window, she could see the three of them, her father in his rocking chair, Eleanor perched prettily on the porch rail, and Jake leaning against a post with his coffee cup balanced in one hand. Eleanor was telling some story, her hands moving expressively, her laugh floating back through the open window. Jake watched her with polite attention, occasionally nodding or responding to a direct question. It was a scene Margaret had witnessed countless times with different players, Eleanor holding court, men falling under her spell. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when she heard boots on the kitchen floor behind her. Thought you could use some help, Jake said. Margaret turned, surprised. You're a guest. Guests don't wash dishes. Maybe not in Boston or Philadelphia. He was already rolling up his sleeves. Out here, everybody pulls their weight. They worked in companionable silence, Jake drying while she washed. His presence filled the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. Margaret found herself acutely aware of small things, the way his shirt pulled across his shoulders when he reached for a plate, the careful way he handled her mother's china. Can I ask you something? He said after a while. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Your father says you've had offers. Marriage offers. I mean, why haven't you accepted any of them? Heat flooded her face. I don't see how that's your business. He set down the plate he was drying, turning to face her fully. Maybe not, but I'm curious all the same. Margaret kept her eyes on the dishwater. The ranch needs me. That's not an answer. She looked up then, something sparking in her chest. Why haven't you married handsome man like you, with property now? Surely there were girls in Texas. There were. His eyes never left hers. None of them were what I was looking for. And what's that? He opened his mouth to answer, but Eleanor's voice cut through the moment. Jake, father's asking about your plans for the Mitchell place. Jake stepped back, the spell broken. Thank you for dinner, Miss Margaret, and for the company. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing at the sink with soapy hands and a racing heart. Through the window, she watched him rejoin the others on the porch, but not before he glanced back at the kitchen, his expression unreadable. Margaret plunged her hands back into the dishwater, scrubbing at a perfectly clean plate. Whatever game Jake Garrison was playing, she wouldn't be a part of it. She'd seen too many men court Eleanor through small kindnesses to her, as if she were a gate they had to pass through. But as the afternoon wore on and Jake's low laughter drifted through the window, Margaret found herself remembering the way he'd said her name, not as an afterthought or a courtesy, but as if it mattered, as if she mattered. When he finally took his leave as the sun touched the horizon, he thanked each of them in turn. Eleanor received a proper bow and a promise to see her at next week's harvest dance. Samuel got a firm handshake and plans to discuss cattle prices later in the week. But when Jake turned to Margaret, still standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, he did something unexpected. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Margaret. Not your family or you all, just her." She nodded, unable to form words, and watched him ride away into the gathering dusk. Eleanor immediately began dissecting every moment of his visit, analyzing each word and gesture for signs of interest. Their father listened with fond amusement, occasionally offering his own observations. Margaret said nothing. She was thinking about tomorrow, and why a single word could feel like a promise. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard when Jake Garrison arrived. Margaret was in the vegetable garden, her hands deep in the soil as she pulled the last of the summer carrots. She heard his horse before she saw him, that steady clip-clop that had become unexpectedly familiar over the past weeks. She didn't look up, even when his shadow fell across the garden rows. Let him think she hadn't noticed. Let him go to the house where Eleanor waited in the parlor, dressed in her afternoon best as always. "Miss Margaret." His voice was closer than she'd expected. She sat back on her heels, shading her eyes with one dirt-stained hand. He stood at the garden gate, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically formal. "Mr. Garrison, Eleanor's inside." "I didn't come to see Eleanor." The words hung in the air between them like dust motes in the slanted light. Margaret's hand stilled on the carrot tops. "I've come to ask your father for your hand," Jake continued, his voice steady as if he were discussing the weather. "Wanted to tell you first, seemed only proper." Margaret's mind went blank. She stared at him, this man who'd spent 5 years on the cattle trails, who had every unmarried woman in the county setting their cap for him. "You're mistaken," she heard herself say. "You mean Eleanor." "I know who I mean." He opened the gate and stepped into the garden, his boots careful between the rows. "I've known since that first Sunday back, maybe before that, if I'm honest." "But," Margaret stood abruptly, carrots scattering. "Eleanor is beautiful, charming, everything a man's supposed to want." Jake moved closer, and Margaret found herself backing up until her skirts brushed the fence. "She's also not you." "I don't understand." "Don't you—" He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I've watched you, Margaret Thornton, watched you hold this place together with pure will, watched you doctor horses and mend fences and keep accounts. You're the strongest woman I know, and I—" "Stop!" The word came out harsher than she intended. "Whatever game you're playing, stop it." His brow furrowed. "Game. Men like you don't marry women like me." She gestured at herself, the dirt-stained apron, the work-roughened hands, the plain brown hair escaping from its pins. "Not when there are women like Eleanor available." "I'm not offering you poetry, Margaret." His voice had gone quiet, serious. "I'm offering you a partnership. The Mitchell place needs work more than I can do alone. I need someone who knows ranching, who won't faint at the sight of blood or complain when dinner's late because a calf's gone missing." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "So you want a business arrangement?" "I want a wife." He reached out as if to touch her, then let his hand fall. "But I won't lie to you. I'm not good with pretty words. Don't know how to court properly. What I know is cattle and land and work. What I know is that when I think about building something lasting, you're the one I picture beside me." "And love?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not sure I know what that word means anymore. Lost too much, seen too much. But I know I look for you first when I ride up. Know I sleep better after I've heard your voice. Know the thought of you married to another man makes me want to put my fist through something. If that's not love, maybe it could grow to be." Margaret turned away, looking out over the garden she'd tended so carefully. Everything in neat rows, everything in its proper place. Jake Garrison was proposing to tear up her careful order, asking her to transplant herself to unfamiliar soil. "Eleanor will be heartbroken," she said finally. "Eleanor will have 3 new proposals by week's end." There was no cruelty in his voice, just simple fact. "You still haven't answered me," You haven't actually asked anything." She heard him exhale, could picture the way his jaw would tighten when he was thinking. Then his hand was on her shoulder, turning her gently to face him. "Margaret Thornton, will you marry me? Will you take on a broken-down ranch and a man who's better with horses than people? I can't promise you'll never regret it, but I can promise you'll never have to wonder where you stand with me." Margaret looked up at him, this weather-beaten man with his two serious eyes and work-scarred hands. She thought about her life here, necessary but invisible, always in Eleanor's shadow. She thought about the Mitchell place with its sagging roof and poisoned well, all the work it would take to make it livable. "I need to talk to my father," she said, "and Eleanor." "Is that a yes?" "It's a let me think." She stepped back, needing distance. "This is sudden." "I've been back 2 months, and spent most of that time in Eleanor's company." "In your family's company," he corrected. "If I'd been courting Eleanor, you'd have known it. Would have taken her riding, brought her flowers, done all the things a man does when he's trying to win a beautiful woman. Instead, I've been watching you and working up the courage for this conversation." Margaret bent to gather the scattered carrots, needing something to do with her hands. Jake knelt to help, and for a moment they worked in silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same carrot. "When do you need an answer?" she asked. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." He stood, offering her a hand up. "But Margaret, don't say no because you think you're doing me a favor. Don't say no because you think I've made a mistake. If you refuse me, let it be for your own reasons." He left then, walking back through the garden gate with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. Margaret stood among the carrot tops and watched him collect his horse, watched him touch his hat to Eleanor through the parlor window, watched him ride away without looking back. She gathered the carrots and walked slowly to the house, inside. Eleanor was at the piano, playing a melancholy piece that matched Margaret's mood. "Jake didn't stay long," Eleanor said without turning around. "No. He's been strange lately. Distant." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the keys. "I thought perhaps I'd offended him somehow." Margaret set the carrots on the kitchen table and went to stand beside her sister. In the late afternoon light, Eleanor looked like a painting too perfect to be real, too beautiful to touch. "Eleanor," she began, then stopped. "How did you tell your sister that the man everyone expected her to marry had chosen you instead?" "What is it?" Eleanor turned on the piano bench, studying Margaret's face. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Jake asked me to marry him." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Eleanor's perfect rosebud mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." Margaret sank onto the settee, suddenly exhausted. "He says he's been watching me, says he needs a partner, someone who understands ranch work." "But," Eleanor's voice had gone small, "everyone knows he's been calling on me." "He's been calling on the family." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap like white birds. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed a small, rueful sound. "I should have seen it," she said. "The way he always managed to find you, even when I tried to keep his attention, the questions he asked Father about you. I thought—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "Eleanor, I haven't said yes." "But you want to." It wasn't a question. Eleanor knew her too well. "Oh, Margaret, all this time I thought you didn't care about such things. Thought you were content with your horses and your account books." "I was." Margaret twisted her hands in her apron. I don't know." Eleanor rose from the piano bench and came to sit beside her. For once, she didn't seem to care about wrinkling her dress. "Do you care for him?" Margaret considered the question. Did she care for Jake? She barely knew him, this man who'd returned from Texas with shadows in his eyes. But she thought about the way he'd helped with dishes, the way he noticed who really kept the ranch running. The way he'd said her name like it was something worth saying. "I could," she admitted, "given time." "Then you should accept." Eleanor took her hand, squeezing gently. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time someone took care of you." "But what about you?" Eleanor's smile was bright and brittle as glass. "Oh, I'll recover. My pride's bruised more than my heart. If I'm honest, I like the idea of Jake Garrison more than the man himself." She tilted her head, studying Margaret with new eyes. "Besides, can you imagine me on that broken-down ranch, trying to cook over a wood stove and haul water from a well I'd last perhaps a week before running home to Papa?" Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling. "Less than that, I'd wager." "You're probably right." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts. "You'll need to tell Father. He's in his study." Margaret made her way down the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knocked on the study door and entered at her father's gruff invitation. Samuel Thornton sat behind his desk, spectacles perched on his nose as he reviewed the account books Margaret had prepared that morning. He looked up as she entered, and something in her face must have given her away. "Ah," he said, setting down his pen. "Young Garrison spoke to you first. Then you knew. He asked my permission yesterday. Good man. That honest about his intentions, clear about what he could offer." Her father removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly. "I told him the decision was yours." "And if I say yes?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "This ranch has been your life. Margaret, you've held it together when I couldn't. Part of me hopes you'll say no, selfish as that is." "Papa?" "Let me finish." He held up a hand. "But another part, the part that loves you as a daughter and not just as help, hopes you'll say yes. You deserve a life of your own, a home that's yours to build. The boy's got a solid head on his shoulders and a good piece of land. More importantly, he sees you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, he looks at you the way a man should look at the woman he's choosing to build a life with. Not like she's a decoration or a convenience, but like she's necessary as breathing." He replaced his spectacles, peering at her over the rims. "Question is, how do you look at him?" Margaret thought about Jake's steady brown eyes, his work-worn hands, the way he moved through the world with quiet certainty. She thought about the Mitchell place with all its problems and potential. She thought about waking up every morning with purpose that was hers to choose, not thrust upon her by circumstance. "I think," she said slowly, "I look at him like possibility." Her father nodded. "Then you have your answer." Margaret left the study and walked back through the house, past Eleanor, who was again at the piano, playing something lighter now. She went out the back door and across the yard to the small hill that overlooked their property. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and she could see for miles across the grassland. Somewhere out there, Jake Garrison was waiting for her answer, not with flowers or poetry, but with honest work and plain speaking, not offering her the moon, but offering her partnership in something real and difficult and worthwhile. Margaret had built her life on practical choices, on doing what needed to be done, but standing there on the hill with the wind tugging at her hair and the whole world spread before her, she realized that choosing Jake might be the first thing she'd ever done purely for herself. Tomorrow, she would ride to the Mitchell place. She would look at the sagging roof and the poisoned well, and she would tell Jake Garrison yes. Not because it was sensible or expected, but because when she thought about the future, he was already in it. The first stars were appearing as she made her way back to the house. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, 2 cups of tea steaming in the cool evening air. "Well?" her sister asked. Margaret accepted the tea, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "I'm getting married." Eleanor smiled, and if there was sadness in it, there was genuine happiness too. "Then we'd better start planning. You'll need a dress, and we'll have to air out Mother's good linens. And, Eleanor," Margaret interrupted gently. "It won't be a big wedding. Jake's not one for fuss, and neither am I." "Oh, Margaret," Eleanor shook her head. "You're allowed to want nice things. You know, you're allowed to be the center of attention for once." Margaret sipped her tea, thinking about Jake's proposal in the garden. No pretty words, no grand gestures, just truth, plain and simple as homespun cloth. It suited her better than all the silken ceremony in the world. "I'll have what matters," she said. "The rest is just trimmings." They sat in comfortable silence. Sisters who'd never quite understood each other but loved each other anyway. Tomorrow would bring changes, challenges, a whole new life to build. But tonight, Margaret was content to sit on the porch she'd known all her life, drinking tea and watching the stars come out one by one. The Mitchell place looked even worse in the harsh light of reality than it had in Margaret's imagination. She stood in what would be her kitchen, studying the warped floorboards and the stove that listed to one side like a drunk cowboy. 3 weeks had passed since their quiet wedding in the church parlor, witnessed by family and a handful of close friends. Now she was Mrs. Jake Garrison, and this sagging structure was her home. Jake appeared in the doorway, his shirt already damp with sweat from the morning's work. "Water pump's fixed," he said. "Should hold until I can get proper parts from town." "That's good." Margaret ran her hand along the kitchen table, one of the few pieces of furniture that had survived the previous owner's departure. It wobbled under her touch. They stood there, two people who'd bound their lives together with little more than hope and determination. The house seemed to echo with all the words they hadn't said to each other, all the small intimacies they'd yet to learn. "I'll be working on the barn roof today," Jake said finally. "Thought I'd ride to town tomorrow for supplies. Make a list of what you need." Margaret nodded, watching him retreat back outside. This had been their pattern for 3 weeks, polite exchanges about practical matters. Careful distances maintained. They moved around each other like dancers who'd never learned the same steps. She spent the morning attacking the kitchen with the fierce energy she'd once reserved for her father's ranch. The stove would need blacking, but she could scrub the rust from its surface. The floors were beyond help in places, but a good sweeping revealed solid wood beneath the dirt. She found dishes in a crate, most of them chipped but serviceable, and washed them in water heated over the temperamental stove. By noon, the kitchen looked less like something abandoned and more like something waiting. Margaret stood back to survey her work, pushing damp hair from her forehead. Through the window, she could see Jake on the barn roof, his movements steady and sure as he replaced rotted shingles. She prepared a simple lunch beans and cornbread, using supplies they'd brought from town. When she called him in, he washed at the pump and took his place at the newly steadied table. "Kitchen looks better," he said, his eyes taking in the changes. "It's a start." Margaret served his plate, then her own. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of forks against china and the wind rattling the loose window panes. "I've been thinking," Jake said suddenly, "about getting some chickens, maybe a milk cow, once the barn's secure." "That would be good. I could sell eggs in town, put the money toward—" She stopped, catching herself. "That is, if you think—" "It's your money to manage as you see fit." He looked at her directly. "I told you, Margaret, this is a partnership." She nodded, returning to her meal. Partnership. Such a bloodless word for marriage. Yet it was what they'd agreed to, what they both claimed to want. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was beating dust from the parlor rug when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw Eleanor's buggy, driven by Tom Morrison with Eleanor beside him in her visiting dress. Margaret smoothed her apron and went to meet them, acutely aware of her work-stained appearance. Eleanor alighted from the buggy with her usual grace, carrying a covered basket. "I've brought you a housewarming gift," Eleanor announced, embracing Margaret carefully to avoid soiling her dress. "Fresh bread and some of Mrs. Patterson's preserves." "Thank you." Margaret accepted the basket, unsure of the proper etiquette for entertaining in a house that barely qualified as habitable. "Would you like to come in?" Eleanor's eyes swept over the sagging porch, the missing shutters, the general air of deterioration. "Perhaps we could sit outside. It's such a lovely day." They settled on the porch steps, Tom Morrison standing awkwardly by the buggy until Eleanor gave him permission to water the horses. Margaret noticed the way he watched her sister, the careful attention he paid to her comfort. "The place has potential," Eleanor said, which was generous even for her. "Once Jake gets it fixed up." "Once we get it fixed up," Margaret corrected gently. "I'm not a china doll to be kept on a shelf." "No, you never were." Eleanor plucked at her skirts. "How is everything?" Margaret understood what she was really asking. How was marriage? How was Jake as a husband? How was it to share a life, a home, a bed with someone who was still essentially a stranger? "It's an adjustment," she said carefully. Eleanor studied her face. "You're not happy?" "I'm not unhappy." Margaret picked at a splinter on the porch step. "We're still finding our way." "Margaret," Eleanor's voice dropped. "If he's unkind to you." "No, nothing like that." Margaret hurried to reassure her. "Jake is considerate, respectful. We're like two horses that haven't learned to pull together yet." Jake chose that moment to appear around the corner of the house, tools in hand. He stopped when he saw they had company, his expression closing off in that way Margaret was beginning to recognize. "Miss Eleanor," he said, touching his hat brim. "Morrison." "We've just come to see how you're settling in," Eleanor said brightly. "I've brought some things from town." "That's kind of you." Jake's eyes found Margaret's. "I'll let you ladies visit. Work to do." He disappeared again, and Eleanor watched him go with a slight frown. "Is he always so focused on work, yes?" Margaret stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Would you like some coffee? I think I've finally mastered the stove." They spent an hour in carefully pleasant conversation, Eleanor sharing town gossip while Margaret showed her the small improvements she'd made to the house. Tom Morrison eventually joined them, contributing observations about cattle prices and weather predictions. When they finally left, Eleanor embraced Margaret again at the buggy. "You know you can always come home," she whispered. If you need to." Margaret pulled back. "This is my home now." Eleanor searched her face, then nodded. "Then I'll pray it becomes what you need it to be." After they'd gone, Margaret returned to her cleaning with renewed energy. She would not be the subject of pity, would not have her sister or anyone else thinking she'd made a mistake. By evening, she had the parlor in reasonable order and had even uncovered a rocking chair that only needed minor repairs. Jake came in as the sun was setting, tired and dusty from his day's work. He paused in the parlor doorway, taking in the changes. "You've been busy." "No more than you." She gestured toward the barn, visible through the window. "The roof looks sound now. Should hold through winter." He shifted his weight, seeming uncertain. "Your sister's visit, was it good?" "Yes, she brought bread." Margaret moved past him toward the kitchen. "I'll heat up supper." They ate quietly again, but this time the silence felt heavier. Margaret could feel questions building between them like thunderclouds. Finally, she set down her fork. "Jake, what are we doing?" He looked up, wariness in his eyes. "Eating supper." "You know what I mean." She twisted her napkin in her lap. "We live in the same house, work the same land, but we're strangers. This isn't what either of us wanted, I think." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table and went to stand by the window, his back to her. "On the trail," he said slowly, "you learn not to want too much. Wanting things you can't have that way lies madness. So you focus on what's in front of you. The next waterhole, the next town, getting the herd through one more day." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. "I came back here thinking I'd put that behind me. Thought I could want things again, a home, a wife, a life that meant something. He turned to face her. Then I saw you that first Sunday, and I wanted, but wanting and having are different things. What did you want? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. You, not just as a partner, not just as help with the ranch. He moved closer, his expression intense. I wanted to know what made you laugh. Wanted to see your hair down. Wanted to wake up beside you and know you were there by choice, not obligation. Margaret's heart was racing. Then why? Because you said yes to a business arrangement. You were clear-eyed about it, practical. I respected that, respected you. He stopped just out of reach. But now we're here, and I don't know how to bridge this gap I've created. Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Maybe you start by trying. Something shifted in his expression. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. I'm not good at this. Neither am I. She caught his hand, holding it against her face. But I'd like to learn. He stepped closer, and Margaret could feel the warmth radiating from him. Could smell the honest sweat of hard work mixed with leather and soap. When he kissed her, it was careful, almost hesitant a question more than a statement. Margaret answered by rising on her toes, her free hand finding the back of his neck. The kiss deepened, 3 weeks of careful distance dissolving in a moment of connection. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Jake rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that 3 weeks ago. Yes, Margaret agreed. You should have. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they didn't retreat to opposite sides of their shared bed. Margaret lay in Jake's arms, listening to his heartbeat and marveling at how natural it felt. They talked in whispers about the ranch, about their plans, about nothing important and everything that mattered. I was terrified, you know, Jake admitted in the darkness. That morning in your garden, thought you'd laugh in my face. I almost did, Margaret confessed. Thought you were playing some cruel joke. Why would I joke about that? She was quiet, choosing her words. Men like you don't usually see women like me. His arm tightened around her. Then men like me are fools. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Jake already up, standing by the window in the gray pre-dawn light. She watched him for a moment, this man who was her husband, who was learning to be more than just the name on a marriage certificate. Coffee, she offered. He turned, and his smile was worth the cold floor under her feet. I'll start the stove. They worked together in the kitchen, a new ease between them. When Jake headed out to tend the horses, he paused to kiss her goodbye, a small gesture that made Margaret's heart lift. She spent the day with a different energy, the house feeling less like a burden and more like possibility. When she found Jake's book left on the kitchen table, she didn't just move it, she opened it. Curious about what he read in the evenings, it was a treatise on cattle breeding, margins filled with his careful notes. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret felt something settle in her chest. This wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself. Wasn't the grand romance Eleanor read about in her novels. But it was real, built on work and truth, and the slow understanding growing between two people who'd chosen each other for practical reasons and were discovering something deeper. Eleanor asked if I was happy, she said suddenly. Jake looked at her, waiting. I didn't know how to answer, but I think I'm learning to be. He reached over, taking her hand. His thumb traced circles on her palm, a simple touch that sent warmth through her entire body. That's enough for now, he said. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Margaret squeezed his hand in response. The house still needed work. The ranch was still struggling, and they were still learning how to be married. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, their hands linked and their shoulders touching, she thought maybe Jake was right. Maybe learning to be happy was enough for now. The rest would come with time. The storm came out of nowhere, the way they sometimes did in late October. Margaret had been watching the sky all morning, noting the strange green tinge to the clouds, the way the cattle huddled together in the far pasture. She'd lived on the plains long enough to read the signs. Jake was in town, had left before dawn to negotiate the sale of some yearlings. He'd kissed her goodbye in the darkness of their bedroom, a casual intimacy that still surprised her after 2 months of marriage. The warmth of that kiss seemed like a lifetime ago as she watched the wall of rain advancing across the grassland. She hurried to secure what she could shuttering windows, moving tools into the barn, checking that the horses were safely stabled. The chickens she'd insisted on buying squawked in protest as she herded them into their coop. By the time the first fat raindrops began to fall, she'd done all she could. The storm hit with a fury that rattled the windows in their frames. Margaret lit the oil lamps against the premature darkness and tried to focus on her mending, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching for a rider who should have been home hours ago. As night fell and the storm intensified, her worry crystallized into fear. The road from town was treacherous in good weather, prone to flash floods when the creek rose. Jake was an experienced horseman, but even the best riders could be caught off guard by weather like this. She was pacing in the kitchen when she heard hoofbeats, barely audible over the rain's roar. Margaret grabbed her shawl and lantern, pushing out into the storm before she could think better of it. Jake materialized out of the darkness like a ghost, soaked through and swaying in the saddle. His horse's head hung low, sides heaving with exhaustion. "Get inside!" he shouted over the wind. But Margaret was already reaching for the horse's bridle. "I'll help with the horse. You're dead on your feet." Together they got the animal into the barn, working in practiced silence to remove the saddle and rub him down. Only when the horse was settled with feed and fresh water did Margaret really look at her husband. Jake was leaning against a stall door, his face gray with fatigue. There was something in his expression she'd never seen before, a vulnerability that made her heart clench. "What happened?" "Creek was already up when I reached it. Current took us." His voice was hoarse. Thought for a moment. He stopped, jaw tightening. Margaret moved closer, placing her hand on his arm, through the wet fabric of his shirt. She could feel him trembling from cold or something else. She wasn't sure. "You're here now," she said softly. "You're safe." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something raw flashed in his eyes. "I kept thinking if I didn't make it back, you'd never know." "Know what?" Instead of answering, he pulled her against him, heedless of his soaked clothes. His kiss was desperate, tasting of rain and fear and something deeper. Margaret responded instinctively, her arms coming up to circle his neck. When they broke apart, both breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers. "That I love you," he said roughly. "Should have told you weeks ago. Should have told you the day I married you, but I was too much a coward." Margaret's throat tightened. "Jake." "No, let me say it." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I told myself I was being practical, choosing you. Told myself it was about the ranch, about finding a partner, but that was a lie. I chose you because I couldn't imagine choosing anyone else. Because you're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. And somehow, that makes me want to protect you from everything, even though you don't need protecting." The barn was cold around them, rain drumming on the roof, but Margaret felt warm to her bones. "I don't need protecting," she agreed. "But sometimes it's nice to have someone who wants to try." They made their way back to the house through the storm, Jake's arm around her shoulders. Inside, Margaret bustled about, heating water for a bath and finding dry clothes. But when she turned from the stove, Jake was watching her with an intensity that stopped her in her tracks. "What is it?" "Just watching you, thinking how empty this place would be without you." He moved closer, seeming to struggle for words. "On the trail. We lost men to rivers. Good men, gone in seconds. Tonight, when that current caught us, all I could think was that I'd wasted so much time. Been so careful with you, so respectful, when what I wanted—" "What did you want?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Everything. The word came out rough, almost angry. I wanted everything with you, and I was too scared to reach for it. Scared you'd remind me this was just an arrangement. Scared I'd want more than you were willing to give. Margaret set down the kettle she'd been holding, her hands not quite steady. You never asked what I was willing to give. I'm asking now. She moved toward him, watching his eyes track her movement. When she was close enough to feel his breath on her face, she said, Everything. I'm willing to give everything. The storm raged outside, but in their bedroom, there was only quiet intensity. They came together like two halves of something broken finally made whole. Jake's hands shook as he unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. Beautiful, he murmured, running his fingers through the dark strands. Wanted to do this since that first Sunday. Margaret traced the lines of his face, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow. I thought you were looking at Eleanor. Never. His hands framed her face. It was always you. From the moment I saw you standing by that corral, watching the sunrise like you were part of it. They loved each other with the storm as witness, with a desperation born of near loss and newly spoken truths. Afterward, they lay entwined, listening to the rain's fury gradually spent against the windows. I was so frightened, Margaret admitted in the darkness. When you were late, when the storm got worse, I kept thinking about this house. Empty again. Jake's arm tightened around her. Takes more than a storm to keep me from you. Promise. She hated how small her voice sounded, how needy. Promise. He pressed a kiss to her temple, though I might avoid creek crossings for a while. That surprised a laugh out of her. Practical man. I'm trying to be, though it's hard to be practical when my wife is warm and soft beside me. Your wife, Margaret repeated, liking the sound of it. Still getting used to that? Plenty of time to practice. They talked through the night, the kind of meandering conversation that lovers have when the world has narrowed to just the two of them. Jake told her about the cattle drive that had changed him, about watching men die for a few dollars in a dream. Margaret shared her own fears of always being second best, of being needed but not wanted. You're needed, Jake said firmly, but you're wanted more. Wanted so much it scares me sometimes. Why does it scare you? He was quiet for a long moment. Because now I have something to lose. The storm had blown itself out by dawn, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Margaret woke to find Jake already dressed, standing by the window with coffee in hand. Surveying the damage, she asked, stretching. He turned, and his smile made her heart skip. Thinking about building on another room, maybe two. Already planning expansions. Man's got to think ahead. He came to sit on the edge of the bed, smoothing her tangled hair. Especially when he's got a family to consider. We're just two people. Jake, for now. His hand drifted to her stomach, a question in his eyes. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's too soon to know. But not too soon to hope. She caught his hand, holding it against her. No, not too soon for that. They spent the day assessing storm damage and making repairs. The chicken coop had lost some boards, and one section of fence was down, but overall they'd weathered it well. They worked side by side, Margaret holding boards while Jake hammered, Jake steadying the ladder while Margaret patched the coop roof. We make a good team, Jake said as they surveyed their handiwork. We do. Margaret wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. Though I could do without the storms. Storm brought us something. He pulled her against his side, knocked some sense into my thick head. Only took 2 months and a near drowning. I'm a slow learner. He kissed the top of her head, but I get there eventually. That evening, as they sat down to a simple supper, Margaret felt the change between them like a physical thing. The careful distances were gone, replaced by casual touches and shared glances. When Jake reached for the salt, his fingers brushed hers deliberately. When she rose to get more coffee, she let her hand trail across his shoulders. "I should write to Eleanor," Margaret said. "Let her know we're all right after the storm. Invite them for Sunday dinner." Jake suggested, "Your father, too. I've been thinking we've been hiding out here like hermits. Time we started acting like a proper family." Margaret looked around the kitchen, still rough but clean and welcoming. "You sure the house isn't—" "The house is fine. It's our home." He caught her hand. "I want them to see that. Want them to see us happy." "Are we happy?" Jake stood, pulling her up with him. "What do you think?" She pretended to consider, even as her heart sang. "I think we're getting there." "Getting there?" He spun her around the kitchen in an impromptu dance. "Woman, I nearly drowned yesterday, and all I could think about was getting back to you. If that's not happiness, I don't know what is." Margaret laughed, letting him lead her in their clumsy waltz. "When you put it that way." They danced until they were both laughing too hard to continue, collapsing against each other in the middle of their kitchen. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the clear post-storm sky. "I love you," Margaret said, the words coming easier now. "Thought you should know, in case you were wondering." "I was wondering," Jake admitted, hoping, but wondering. No more wondering. She pulled his head down for a kiss. No more careful distances. No more being afraid. No more. He agreed against her lips. From now on, we're all in. Later, as they prepared for bed, Margaret found herself humming something she hadn't done in years. Jake watched from the doorway, a soft smile on his face. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Nothing. Just your humming. You sound happy." "I am happy." She moved into his arms, feeling the solid warmth of him. "Storm and all, I'm happy." "Good." He held her close, swaying slightly as if they were still dancing. "That's all I wanted. You know, to make you happy." "You do," Margaret assured him. "More than I ever expected." They stood there in their bedroom, holding each other as full dark settled over the ranch. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges. The ranch still needed so much, and winter was coming. But tonight, with the storm past and truth spoken between them, Margaret felt rich beyond measure. "Bed," Jake suggested, his voice low and warm. "Bed," she agreed, taking his hand, as they settled into sleep, tangled together in the middle of their bed instead of clinging to opposite edges. Margaret thought about the storm that had nearly taken him, how it had washed away the last barriers between them, leaving something clean and new in its wake. "Sometimes," she thought drowsily, "it took a storm to show you what really mattered, and what mattered was this Jake's heartbeat under her hand, his breath stirring her hair, the life they were building together board by board and day by day. The rest, as Jake had said, they'd figure out as they went along." Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers by surprise. Margaret had been feeling poorly for weeks, attributing it to the change of seasons and the extra work of preparing for the cold months ahead. But when the fever came, swift and merciless, she knew this was something more. Jake found her collapsed by the chicken coop on a Tuesday morning. The empty feed bucket rolled away in the frost-brittle grass. He carried her to the house, her body burning against his chest despite the December cold. "Just tired," she mumbled against his shoulder. "The chickens." "Forget the chickens." His voice was tight with fear. "You're burning up." He put her to bed and rode hard for town, returning with a doctor, Hartwell just as the first snow began to fall. The old physician's face was grave as he examined her, his practiced hands gentle but thorough. "Pneumonia," he said quietly, drawing Jake out into the hallway. "Both lungs affected. She's young and strong, but—" he shook his head. "These next few days will be critical. Keep her warm. Get fluids into her when you can. I'll leave laudanum for the pain. Jake's jaw tightened. There must be something else. Prayer. Doctor, Hartwell said simply. And don't leave her alone. Sometimes having someone to fight for makes all the difference. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of fever and struggle. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the fire in her chest and the constant presence beside her bed. Jake's voice anchored her to the world, reading from her father's Bible, telling stories of the trail, or simply talking about the ranch and all the things they'd do come spring. Got a letter from Eleanor, he said one afternoon, his voice deliberately light. She's engaged to Tom Morrison. Says they're planning a June wedding. You'll need to get well so you can help with the planning. You know Eleanor can't make a decision without you. Margaret tried to respond, but the words dissolved into coughing that left her gasping. Jake lifted her carefully, supporting her while the spasms passed, his hand rubbing slow circles on her back. That's it, he murmured. Get it out. You're doing fine. But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The fever climbed higher each night, and her breathing grew more labored. Jake stopped leaving the room except to tend the absolute necessities. He slept in the chair beside the bed, waking at every change in her breathing. On the fourth night, the worst night, Margaret's fever spiked so high she no longer recognized him. She thrashed weakly, calling for her mother dead these 10 years and pushing away the cooling cloths he tried to place on her forehead. Please, Jake whispered, his voice breaking. Please don't leave me. I just found you. We just found each other. He gathered her into his arms, heedless of Dr. Hartwell's warnings about contagion. She was so small against him, her body racked with shivers despite the fever. He held her through the long darkness, talking until his voice went hoarse. Remember the storm? He asked, rocking her gently. You were so brave, coming out into that rain for me. Stubborn woman, I thought. Beautiful, stubborn woman who won't let a man drown in peace. His laugh was more sob than sound. Can't be stubborn now, though. Can't fight me on this. So I'm telling you straight, you don't get to die. You hear me? Margaret Garrison, you don't get to die. Toward dawn, something shifted. The terrible heat began to break, and Margaret's breathing, while still labored, seemed less desperate. Jake felt the change before he understood it, hope flaring in his chest like a struck match. That's my girl, he whispered. That's my fighter. Margaret opened her eyes, truly opened them, seeing him for the first time in days. Jake! Her voice was barely a thread of sound. I'm here. He pressed his lips to her forehead, finding it damp but cooler. I'm right here. The chickens. He laughed, the sound wild with relief. Woman, you nearly die and you're worried about the chickens. They're fine. Everything's fine now. But recovery was slow. Frustratingly slow for someone accustomed to hard work and independence. Margaret spent weeks in bed, too weak to do more than sit up for short periods. Jake became nurse and caretaker, roles that sat strangely on his broad shoulders but which he embraced with determined tenderness. He learned to make broth that she could keep down, to change bedding without jostling her too much, to read her moods from the tiny furrows between her brows. When she fretted about the work not getting done, he'd tell her elaborate lies about how well he was managing. Fix the barn door today, he'd say, not mentioning he'd nearly taken his thumb off with the hammer because he'd been running on 2 hours' sleep. Eleanor came to help when the roads were passable, bringing food and keeping Margaret company while Jake caught up on the most urgent chores. The sisters would sit together in the bedroom, Eleanor chattering about wedding plans while she brushed Margaret's hair. You gave us such a scare, Eleanor said one afternoon. Her usual brightness dimmed. When Jake rode up to the house that day, I thought... She stopped, blinking back tears. Don't do that again. I'll try not to. Margaret caught her sister's hand. Tell me about your dress. Is Mrs. Holloway making it? It was during one of Eleanor's visits that Margaret first made it from the bed to the kitchen under her own power. Jake had forbidden her to try, but she was tired of being an invalid, tired of the same four walls. She made it as far as the kitchen table before her legs gave out. That's where Jake found her when he came in from the barn, slumped in a chair with tears of frustration on her cheeks. "What are you doing?" He was beside her in 2 strides, checking her over for injury. "I wanted to make dinner. You've been doing everything. And I thought," she gestured helplessly at the stove, "I can't even stand long enough to cook." "Margaret." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "You almost died. Do you understand that I almost lost you?" "But I didn't die." She gripped his hands tightly. "I'm here. I'm getting better. And I need to be useful again. I need to be your wife, not your patient." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Then he stood, pulling her carefully to her feet. "All right, we'll cook together. You sit and tell me what to do." It became their new routine, Margaret directing from a chair while Jake followed her instructions with varying degrees of success. He was a quick learner, though, and soon could produce a passable meal without too much guidance. "Never thought I'd be learning to cook," he said one evening, checking the biscuits in the oven. Trail cook would have laughed himself sick. "You're doing fine." Margaret smiled at the flour in his hair. "Though you might want to use less force when kneading the dough. It's not a steer you're wrestling." Slowly, painfully slowly, her strength returned. First, she could stand long enough to wash dishes. Then she could make it to the henhouse and back without resting. Each small victory felt enormous. The day she finally managed to do a full day's work cooking, cleaning, tending the chickens, even helping Jake repair a harness, she felt like herself again. That night, as they sat by the fire, Jake watched her with an expression she couldn't read. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Just thinking." He reached for her hand. "About how close I came to losing this. Losing you." "But you didn't." "No." He brought her hand to his lips. "But it changed things. Made me realize how much I'd been taking for granted. How every ordinary day with you is a gift." Margaret moved from her chair to curl beside him on the small sofa. "I heard you, during the fever. Heard you telling me not to die." "Ordering you, more like." His arm came around her. "Figured if I was firm enough about it, you'd have to obey." "I always was contrary." "Thank God for that." He pressed a kiss to her hair. A biddable woman might have given up. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance. Outside, snow was falling again, but inside they were warm and safe and together. "I've been thinking," Margaret said eventually, "about what Dr. Hartwell said about having something to fight for." "Oh, I fought for you, for this life we're building, for the chance to see spring on our own land." She tilted her head to look at him. "For the children we might have someday." Jake's hand splayed across her stomach, a gesture that had become habit. "Someday soon, maybe." She covered his hand with hers. "Would that make you happy?" "You make me happy, everything else is extra blessing." Margaret smiled, settling more firmly against him. The winter had been harder than either of them had expected, but they'd survived it, together. She'd faced death and chosen life, chosen to fight for this man and this land and this future they were creating day by day. "I love you," she said, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. "Love you back," he replied, tightening his hold, now and always. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. In the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, but in the small circle of firelight, Margaret and Jake held each other and counted their blessings, chief among them the simple gift of another ordinary evening together. Spring would come, as it always did, and when it arrived, they'd be ready for it, stronger for having weathered the storm, closer for having faced the darkness. But for now, this was enough, the two of them, whole and healing, watching the fire burn down to embers while snow fell soft and silent on the world outside. The spring evening was unseasonably warm, and Margaret had opened all the windows to let in the sweet air. She was mending one of Jake's shirts by lamplight when she heard his boots on the porch slower than usual, hesitant. When he appeared in the doorway, she knew something had shifted. His face carried that closed expression she'd learned to recognize, the one he wore when wrestling with thoughts too large for easy words. "Supper's keeping warm," she said, setting aside her sewing. "Not hungry just yet." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Mind if we talk?" Margaret's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Of course." Jake crossed to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. "Finally," he said. "Been thinking about what you said, during your illness, about having something to fight for. I remember. Made me realize I've been a coward." He turned to face her, his expression raw. "Not about the work or the ranch, about us, about what I feel for you." Margaret stood slowly, her hands clasped to keep them from trembling. "Jake." "Let me finish." He moved closer, still holding that battered hat like a shield. "When I asked you to marry me, I told myself I was being honest, practical, but I was lying to both of us. Truth is, I was scared. Scared of wanting you too much. Scared of what it would mean to really let you in. And now I'm more scared of wasting what we have." He set the hat aside, reaching for her hands. "I've been holding back, Margaret, keeping part of myself locked away because it felt safer. But when you were sick, when I thought," his voice roughened, "I realized safe isn't worth much if it means not really living." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say I love you, not just as a partner or a helpmate, but the way a man loves a woman when she's carved into his bones. I love your strength and your stubbornness. I love the way you hum when you're happy and bite your lip when you're thinking. I love that you see me not the trail boss or the rancher, but me." The tears spilled over then, and Margaret didn't try to stop them. "Jake." "I know I'm not good with words. No, I'm probably making a mess of this. But I needed you to know. Needed to stop pretending this is just some business arrangement that happened to work out." He cupped her face gently, thumbs brushing away her tears. "You're my heart, Margaret. Have been since that day in the garden. Maybe before, I just took too long to admit it." Margaret pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of tears and truth. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, she kept her hands fisted in his shirt. "You impossible man. I've been in love with you for months." "Why didn't you say?" "Because you needed to say it first." She smoothed the fabric she'd wrinkled. "Needed to know you'd chosen me, not just accepted what was offered." Jake made a sound that was part laugh, part groan. "We're a pair of fools." "Maybe, but we're our own fools now." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Margaret felt something unlock in her chest. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with promise. "Come to bed." "What about supper?" "It'll keep." He took her hand, leading her toward their bedroom. "Got more important things to tend to." Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Jake traced lazy patterns on Margaret's bare shoulder. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the bed, and she could hear the night sounds of the ranch through the open window. "I need to tell you something else," Jake said quietly. Margaret tensed slightly. "More confessions." "In a way." He shifted to look at her directly. "That day by the creek, during the storm, it wasn't the first time I'd nearly died. On the trail, there were moments, but they never mattered the same way. Never made me think about what I'd leave behind. Because you had nothing to leave. Because I had nothing to lose." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Now I do. Now I have you, this place, this life we're building. It terrifies me sometimes, how much I have to lose." Margaret turned in his arms, pressing close. You're not going to lose it. We're not going to lose each other. Promise. I survived pneumonia, didn't I, after that? Everything else seems manageable. Jake's laugh rumbled through his chest. Suppose that's true, though I'd rather not test it again. Agreed. She yawned, fatigue finally catching up. No more near-death experiences for either of us. I'll do my best. He pulled the quilt up over them both. Sleep now. Tomorrow's a busy day. But Margaret wasn't quite ready for sleep. Jake, what made you decide to tell me tonight? He was quiet so long she thought he might have dozed off. Then, saw Tom Morrison in town today. He was buying ribbon for Eleanor, fretting over whether she'd prefer blue or green. Made me think about all the things I haven't done for you, all the small gestures I've been too proud or scared to make. I don't need ribbons. I know, but you deserve them. Deserve to be courted properly, even if it's after the wedding. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Deserve a husband who's not afraid to tell the world he's mad about his wife. Margaret smiled against his chest. I think you just did. In private doesn't count. Tomorrow. I'm going to make sure everyone knows. Might even buy you ribbons. Jake Garrison, if you start buying me ribbons, I'll know you've lost your mind. Maybe something more practical then. New boots, a better cook stove. Now you're talking. She nestled closer. Though the stove we have works fine, now that we've both learned to manage it. They drifted into comfortable silence, and Margaret felt herself sliding towards sleep. But Jake spoke once more, his voice soft in the darkness. Thank you. For what? For waiting for me to find my courage, for not giving up when I was being a fool, for fighting to stay when the fever tried to take you. His arms tightened around her. For choosing me when you could have had easier. Margaret lifted her head to kiss him softly. I didn't want easier. I wanted you. Still can't fathom why. Because you're worth it. We're worth it. She settled back against him. Now sleep, or you'll be useless tomorrow. This time Jake did as ordered, his breathing evening out into sleep. But Margaret lay awake a bit longer, marveling at the fullness in her chest. They'd come so far from that awkward wedding day, from the careful distances and unspoken fears. She thought about the ranch, already showing signs of prosperity under their combined efforts. The garden she'd planted was thriving. The chicken flock had doubled, and Jake had negotiated good prices for their cattle. More than that, though, the house had become a home, their home, filled with shared laughter and quiet evenings, with work and rest and all the small intimacies of married life. The clock in the parlor chimed midnight, and Margaret finally closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was always more work than hours on a ranch. But tonight, wrapped in her husband's arms with his love finally spoken between them, she felt rich beyond measure. I love you, she whispered into the darkness, knowing he was too deeply asleep to hear but needing to say it anyway. As if in response, Jake pulled her closer, murmuring something unintelligible against her hair. Margaret smiled and let sleep take her, dreaming of spring mornings and shared harvests, of children's laughter in these rooms and years of ordinary miracles stretching ahead. In the morning, true to his word, Jake was different. Not in large ways, he was still the same steady, practical man she'd married, but he touched her more freely, smiled more readily. When Tom Morrison came by to discuss buying a bull, Jake kept one arm around Margaret's waist as they talked business, as natural as breathing. You two seem happy, Tom observed, his own grin knowing. We are, Jake said simply, pressing a kiss to Margaret's temple. Best decision I ever made, marrying this woman. Tom laughed. Wait till I tell Eleanor. She'll be insufferable about her matchmaking skills. Eleanor didn't matchmake us, Margaret protested. No, but she'll take credit anyway. You know how she is. After Tom left, Margaret turned in Jake's arms. You know the whole county will be talking by week's end. Let them talk. He cupped her face, studying her with those serious brown eyes. I want everyone to know you're mine. Want them to see how lucky I am. We're both lucky. Maybe, but I'm luckier. He kissed her soundly, right there in the barn where anyone could see. Now, about that cook stove. Margaret laughed, pushing at his chest. We have work to do, Mr. Garrison. Save your sweet talk for later. Yes, ma'am. But he stole another kiss before letting her go. Though I plan to do plenty of sweet talking later. As Margaret returned to the house, she caught herself humming again that same unconscious expression of contentment that had surprised her months ago. But now it felt natural, as much a part of her days as sunrise and hard work. She paused at the kitchen door, looking back at Jake as he led the horses to pasture. He must have felt her gaze because he turned, touching his hat brim in that gesture she'd come to love. Even from a distance, she could see his smile. This was happiness, she realized. Not the dramatic, desperate passion of Eleanor's novels, but something deeper and more sustaining. It was knowing you were loved, truly and completely. It was having someone to share both burdens and joys. It was building something together, day by day, season by season. Margaret went inside to start dinner, her heart light and her hands steady. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, she thought as she reached for her apron, was everything. The years had been kind to the Garrison Ranch. Margaret stood on the porch she'd helped Jake rebuild 3 summers ago, watching the sunset paint the grasslands gold. The sagging structure they'd started with was now a proper home, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. From inside came the sound of children's laughter and Jake's patient voice explaining something about horses to their eldest. 5 years. It seemed both forever and no time at all since that storm-tossed night when they'd finally spoken their truths. Margaret's hand went unconsciously to her rounded belly, where their 3rd child grew. This land, this life it had given them so much more than either had dared hope for that day in her father's garden. Mama, Papa says to tell you supper's ready. 7-year-old Samuel burst through the door, all knees and elbows and his father's serious eyes. He made biscuits. Did he now? Margaret ruffled her son's dark hair. Best go wash up then. As Samuel raced back inside, Margaret lingered a moment longer. The ranch spread before her the sturdy barn, the thriving garden, the cattle growing fat on good grass. But more than the physical improvements, she saw the life they'd built, the neighboring ranchers who'd become friends, the hired hands who stayed season after season because Jake treated them fair, the sense of belonging that ran deeper than deed or title. Are you coming, or do I need to carry you? Jake appeared in the doorway, their youngest on his hip. 2-year-old Rose had his coloring but Margaret's stubborn chin, a combination that promised interesting times ahead. I can still walk, thank you very much. For now. He shifted Rose to one arm and offered Margaret the other. Another month, and I might have to build a wider door. She swatted him lightly. Keep talking like that and you'll be sleeping in the barn. Mama hit Papa, Rose announced with glee. Papa deserved it, Margaret said, taking Jake's arm anyway. Inside, their home showed the comfortable wear of family life. Toys shared space with Jake's ranching journals. Margaret's mending basket sat beside his leather-working tools. The kitchen she'd once scrubbed to bare functionality now bloomed with curtains Eleanor had sewn and shelves Jake had built to hold her growing collection of preserves. Samuel was already at the table, swinging his legs impatiently. Jake settled Rose in her high chair while Margaret checked the stove, true to Samuel's word. A pan of golden biscuits waited alongside a pot of stew. You're getting better at this, she said, sampling the stew. Had a good teacher. Jake caught her around the waist, pulling her back against him. His hand splayed over her belly, feeling the baby move. How's our little one today? Active, takes after the others. She leaned into his warmth. Doctor, Hartwell says everything looks fine. Should be an easy delivery. No delivery's easy. His arms tightened. I'll be right there with you, just like before. Papa, I'm hungry. Samuel's protest broke the moment. They settled around the table. Jake sang grace while Rose banged her spoon and Samuel fidgeted. It was chaos, Margaret thought with satisfaction. Beautiful, blessed chaos. Mr. Morrison came by today, Jake said, serving the children first. Wanted to know if we'd sell him that yearling bull. The one with the white face. What did you tell him? That I'd need to discuss it with my business partner. He winked at her. What do you think? They talked over the decision while eating. Samuel interjecting opinions about bulls with the confidence of a child raised around cattle. Rose mostly focused on making as much mess as possible with her stew. It was wonderfully ordinary. The kind of evening Margaret had never dared imagine when she was the spinster sister keeping her father's ranch afloat. After supper, while Jake supervised the children's baths, Margaret stepped outside again. The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear sky. She heard footsteps and smiled without turning. Children asleep. Samuel's pretending to be. Rose went down fighting. Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. Remember our first night here? When the stove wouldn't light and we ate cold beans for dinner. And you didn't complain once. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I knew then I'd chosen right. Even though I wasn't Eleanor. Especially because you weren't Eleanor. He turned her in his arms. She came by today. Actually, brought some fabric for the baby. She's convinced it's another boy. What do you think? I think I don't care, long as you both come through safe. His voice roughened. Can't go through that fear again. Margaret reached up to cup his face. We'll be fine. I'm stronger now than I was with Samuel. And you've gotten Dr. Hartwell to agree to stay the night when my time comes. Stop borrowing trouble. Can't help it. You and these children, you're everything. We're not going anywhere. She pulled his head down for a kiss. You're stuck with us. Jake Garrison. Best trap I ever walked into. They stood there in the gathering darkness, swaying slightly as if to music only they could hear. From the barn came the comfortable sounds of horses settling for the night, somewhere in the distance. A coyote called and was answered. The church social's next week, Margaret said eventually. Mrs. Patterson specifically asked if you'd be playing your fiddle. Jake groaned. That woman won't take no for an answer. Then say yes. The children love when you play. You just want to show off. But his complaint was mild. Fine, but I'm not playing more than 3 songs. 5. 4, and that's final. Margaret smiled against his chest. Deal. They went inside, Jake banking the fire while Margaret checked on the children. Samuel had given up pretending and was genuinely asleep, one arm flung over his head in abandonment. Rose was curled like a kitten, thumb firmly in mouth despite their efforts to break the habit. In their own room, as Margaret brushed out her hair, she caught Jake watching her in the mirror. What? Just thinking how you've changed, how we've both changed. She set down the brush. For the better, I hope. Without question, he came to stand behind her, taking over the brushing with gentle strokes. You're more beautiful now than the day I married you. Flatterer, I'm weather-worn and thick with your child. Beautiful, he repeated firmly, and brave and strong and mine. Margaret turned on the small stool, looking up at him. Do you ever regret it choosing the practical sister? Sometimes I wonder. Jake silenced her with a kiss. Never, not once. You want to know what I see when I look at you? She nodded, suddenly unable to speak. I see the woman who helped me build this place board by board, who birthed our children with courage that humbles me, who knows when the cattle are sick before I do and can stretch $1 further than anyone has a right to. He knelt before her, taking her hands. I see my wife, my partner, my love, I see the life I never knew I wanted until you showed me it was possible." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "Jake!" "I'm not finished." His thumbs brushed her tears away. "That day in the garden, I said I couldn't promise you wouldn't regret it. Can you honestly say you do?" "No," she whispered. "Never, not for a moment." Then no more wondering, no more doubts. We chose each other. Margaret. And we choose each other again every morning when we wake up and face whatever the day brings. He stood, pulling her up with him. "Now come to bed. Morning comes early with children." As they settled into bed, Margaret curled against Jake's side, her head on his shoulder. His hand found her belly again, protective and gentle. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About that first year, how we tiptoed around each other like strangers." "We were strangers, in a way. Not anymore." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Now I know you steal the covers in winter. Know you can't start the day without coffee. Know you sing to the chickens when you think no one's listening." "I do not sing to the chickens." "Oh, Susanna, just last Tuesday." Margaret buried her face against his chest, laughing. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "I hear everything, know everything. Like how you add extra sugar to my coffee when I've had a hard day. How you mend my shirts with tiny stitches no one else would bother with. How you look at me sometimes when you think I'm not watching, like I hung the moon." "Because you did," she said softly. "For me, you did." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their home. The house creaked gently, settling into itself. From down the hall came Samuel's soft snore, just like his father's. "Jake. I'm glad you turned away from Eleanor. Glad you saw something in me worth choosing." He shifted to look at her in the moonlight. "I didn't turn away from her. Margaret, I turned toward you. There's a difference." "What difference?" "One implies settling for second best. The other means recognizing what you really want." He cupped her face gently. "You were never second best. You were the only choice that made sense, the only one that made my heart race and my palms sweat like a green boy's. Still do." Margaret kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, she said, "We've built something good here." "We have." Jake settled back, pulling her close. "And we're not done yet. This little one will need a room. Maybe add a second floor while we're at it. Samuel's getting big enough to want his own space." "Already planning expansions?" "Always. That's what you do when you're building something to last." His hand rubbed slow circles on her back. "This ranch, this family, we're just getting started." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "I love you, Jake Garrison." "Love you back, Margaret Garrison, today, tomorrow, and all the days after," as sleep claimed them. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. Two practical people making a practical arrangement. Or so they'd told themselves. But somewhere between that first awkward dinner and this moment, they'd built something extraordinary from ordinary pieces. Love had crept in through the cracks, steady and sure as sunrise. The house stood strong around them, filled with children's dreams and parents' hopes. The ranch prospered under their combined care. And in the quiet of their bedroom, two people who had once been strangers lay entwined, having chosen each other not just once but 1,000 times over in 1,000 small ways. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But inside the Garrison home, love had taken root and flourished, growing stronger with each passing season. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales or dime novels. It was better, it was real, earned through work and trust and the daily choice to build something together. And that, Margaret thought as she drifted off to sleep, was the greatest fortune of all. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from so we can connect with each other. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Jake's journey. What touched your heart the most? Let's discuss in the comments.